So let's think about what sort of affects these four variables. Okay, so let's start with the cost. So it's easier to think about the costs first, so we'll think about the costs right now. So let's unpack, C1. Right, so C1, if you recall, is just the physical cost of moving from one country to another. It doesn't take into account any of the legal system or the illegality of it. It's literally just the cost of renting the moving van and driving it, across two borders. Okay, so C1 would be affected by anything that makes it more costly to do so in terms of dollars, except for the costs imposed by the legal system. Right. These are, things like how far, family consideration, friends, the cost of finding a new job, all that kind of stuff. Okay, C2 and C3 so this one, this is the familiar. Costs of moving that we've sort of talked about plenty, this semester already. C2, right? These are the more interesting things. So these are C2 and C3 are influenced by the legal institutions of both the country that you currently live in and the country that you want to emigrate to. So depending on the countries in question, these costs can be very large, prohibitively so, or perhaps even vanishingly small. And so in the case of the U.S., it's clear that C2 and C3 are both positive, which is just saying that, if you want to move from a different country to the United States legally, you're going to have to do some paperwork, right? And if you want to move here illegally, right, you run the risk of basically being discovered and having potentially bad things happen to you if you get discovered as, an illegal immigrant, right? Okay, so people who want to immigrate to the U.S. have to pass a background check. They have to provide, some sort of documentation of where they're going to be living and where they're going to work. And they must also provide notice when either of these change to the proper authorities, right? People who move here illegally, so for C3, right? People who move here illegally don't have to do this, but they also have to be wary of the fact that if they're caught here, they face serious penalties, including fines and possibly even deportation. In fact, so here's a fun story. One of my good friends from graduate school was recently deported back to the United Kingdom because he was unable to find work within 60 days of losing his then, at the time, current job, right? And the other interesting thing is he couldn't find someone that would marry him on such short notice. So there was a whole big drama about this, and it was actually pretty funny. So C2 is the cost of like the paperwork, the background checks, right, and everything else. Okay, and C3 is the fear, basically. The fear of being caught / deported / jailed, or whatever the fine is for being caught in a country that's illegal, or being caught illegally in a country. Now C3 itself is going to be influenced by the probability of detecting. All right, so C3 is equal to a function of the probability of detection and the actual cost of being in of the thing. So, and the punishment, or the severity of the punishment. Right? And this sort of idea comes from a guy named Gary Becker, who wrote a great paper in 1968 on the economics of crime. And so I've put that in Blackboard for you guys to go read. I do, highly recommend reading it. It's one of the seminal papers in all of economics, won him a Nobel Prize in 1992. So I do, highly recommend reading it. You can skip over the mathy stuff, but what he says is that the cost of doing a crime is a function of the probability of being detected and the severity of the punishment. Okay? And so, the higher the probability of detection, the higher the cost of doing crime. And the higher the punishment, obviously the higher the cost of doing crime. So if you've ever wondered why some, some quote-unquote victimless crimes have severe punishments if you're caught, right? But, some other, very clear victimed crimes have relatively small punishment if you're caught. You could think about it as being a function of how difficult it is to detect the crime, right? So if you think about it, it's a bit weird if you don't understand this, if you didn't know about this or didn't think about this, you might find it strange that the penalty for, downloading a movie off of BitTorrent or whatever might be, $1 million fine and, tens and tens of years in jail, right? While the penalty for hitting a construction worker is something like $7,500 and 10 years in jail, right? Downloading a movie, it seems to me, is much worse than, killing a construction worker. But, for some reason, the penalty is lower. Well, so it turns out the probability of detecting you if you download something illegally is very, very low. So in order to dissuade you from doing it, they make the punishment very, very high. The probability of detecting you if you hit a construction worker is very high. It's damn near 100, right? 100%. And so the punishment actually is low, right? Because the probability of detecting you is very high. And so the expected punishment of the crime is high. So I'm sure some of you have downloaded videos or music or something like that illegally. And so the expected punishment of doing so must be very, very small, right? Despite its large punishment. But anyway, so C2 and C3 are totally influenced by the countries that you're considering moving from and to. Okay, and so those countries, they can make them large, they can make them small, they can do whatever they want, right? So in Europe, for example, C2 and C3 are basically zero for European citizens, right? As they will frequently have some sort of reciprocity with one another, right? Especially countries in the European Union. And what these do is they make it easy for people to sort of live in one country and work in another. And even move across countries. It's actually apparently very simple to do this. And so one summer when I was in college, I spent the summer working at a factory in Switzerland, and I lived with a family in Austria. And we rode across the border, every single day, twice a day, going to and from work, right? And if we went out at night, we probably went out in Switzerland, and so we would go across the Swiss border, and, we'd just drive right by it. There were border police there, but you just kind of smile and wave at them, and you go right through. Imagine just smiling and waving at the people at the Canadian border, right? It'd be a very different world. Okay, so those are sort of the costs associated with emigration and immigration. On the benefits side, the benefits of moving, they can vary immensely from person to person, depending on several factors. So the benefits will be a function of a few things, right? So they'll be a function of the person's age. So like older people tend not to immigrate to a different country because they're going to have fewer productive years left in their life, okay? Which sounds crass, I know, but that's just a reality. So they'll have fewer benefits, and so their stream of benefits, if we go back to here, right, their N would be smaller. So imagine, if you've got 2 years left to live, all of a sudden your expected benefits are only, 20 grand, right? And so, that's not exactly worth it to a whole lot of people, and so, a lot of older people, I should say. And so they don't really find it worthwhile, okay? A second one for age, right, is the fact that as we get older, our cultural ties become stronger, which just raises C1, right? Other things that can, affect the benefits are your education. So more educated people typically, earn more, but they earn especially more in countries that reward those things. So, there's lots of interesting things with education, right? So, some of you will probably graduate this year and go work for multinational corporations, and you'll have opportunities to work in lots of different countries, which is a great opportunity, and you should, take advantage of it. Okay, so age, education, it turns out gender is still a big thing, especially for immigration. We have, let's see, having kids, right? There's all kinds of things. So if you go to a different country, you might be able to get your kids a better education, maybe. There's all kinds of things on the benefits side, okay? Now, as for like the empirical results, so generally speaking, it's tough to find data on the specific benefits and costs of emigrating and immigrating. However, some data does exist, especially in the case of the U.S. and Mexico. So in general, workers who move, so let's call this, Mexico, and we'll call this the U.S., right? So in general, workers who move from Mexico to the U.S. make somewhere between $9,000 and what I find $16,000 more per year, right? Which is a huge increase, especially, and this is as of the year 2000, right? Which is a huge increase in their salary, especially when you consider the fact that Mexico, the average salary is somewhere around $9,700. So if you're earning an additional $9,000 to $16,000 per year, you're basically almost always going to be doubling what you could have earned in Mexico, right? And so now what we have is sort of a model for understanding under what conditions people will want to emigrate or stay in their home country. And so the next question that we would need to consider would be sort of what happens to the host country as a result of people immigrating into the country. Okay, and so, we know why people would move, right? If the benefits of doing so are greater than all of the costs, right? C1 plus C2 or C1 plus C3, then they will move, right? They'll emigrate to a different country. So we understand the decision from the potential immigrant's point of view, okay? So now what we want to do is we want to sort of understand the decision of the country, of the host country, the country that people are moving to. So we want to focus, so we understand this path, right? We understand why people would move this way. And what we want to do is understand the impact that this has sort of on the U.S., right? And remember, in the case of the United States, the U.S. gets to determine C2 and C3, right? So we get to decide what these two costs here are, and in doing so, we can help shape the decisions of the people that want to move. So if we make it sufficiently costly to move here, right? If we raise C2 and C3, we will prevent immigration, right? We can do that. It's not rocket science, really. We could do it. It wouldn't be too difficult, right? But we need to consider the question of how we do that, why we would do that, and under what conditions we would want to do it. So, for example, the people of the U.S., right, we get to determine C2 and C3. So under what conditions, right, the question I'm asking is when to raise or lower C2 and or C3, right? And so those are that's the question that we want to ask here. When do we raise C2? When do we lower C2? When do we raise C3? And when do we lower C3?